The day Beaumont Memorial Hospital hired Rochelle Dumas as their new chief nursing officer, 6 people in that building decided she needed to be broken before she could be built. They didn't say it out loud. People like that never do. They said it with the coffee that was never made for her, with the supply orders that got lost, with the scheduling changes that only ever affected her unit, with the way they laughed, just loud enough whenever she walked through the door. Rochelle was 53 years old. She had spent 21 years in the United States Army Nurse Corps, 12 of those as a trauma nurse in forward operating bases in places most people couldn't find on a map. She had overseen field hospitals with no running water, no blood supply, and incoming fire. She had made decisions in 30-second windows that determined whether someone lived or died. She had done all of this quietly, competently, and without ever once needing anyone's approval. None of that was on the surface. When Rochelle walked into Beaumont Memorial that first Monday in March, she wore a pale gray blazer, small pearl earrings, and an expression that gave nothing away. She carried a leather portfolio she'd had for 15 years. She introduced herself to the floor nurses first, before she ever introduced herself to administration. She remembered every name she was told. The 6 people who had already decided she was a problem did not notice any of this. They were too busy deciding. The one who started it was a man named Stuart Keene. Director of Operations, 14 years at Beaumont, the kind of man who had never once questioned whether he deserved the chair he sat in. Stuart was 58, white, broad-shouldered, and accustomed to being the loudest person in the room, not because he raised his voice, but because he had spent a decade and a half making sure the room was arranged in a way that amplified him. When the hospital board brought in Rochelle, recruited her specifically, flew her in from Baltimore, offered her a signing package, Stuart had seen and quietly resented. Stuart had gone to the chief medical officer, Dr. Harold Penn, and said the words he always used when he wanted something to disappear without fingerprints. "I just want to make sure the transition is smooth." Dr. Penn, who had been at Beaumont for 26 years and understood every word Stuart did not say, had nodded and gone back to his notes. Stuart had taken that nod as permission. The others followed his lead, as they always had. Gwen Aldridge, head of HR, who had a gift for applying policy with surgical precision to the people she wanted gone, and remarkable amnesia when it came to the people she wanted to keep. Lawrence Peck, director of facilities, who controlled which requests got processed and which ones sat in a queue for weeks. Diane Volkov, the outgoing CNO who had expected her contract to be renewed, and was still present, technically, in a transition advisory role that everyone understood was an insult dressed in professional language. Victor O'Mara, a charge nurse with 17 years of seniority and a following among the older staff, and Pam Duchesne, the administrative coordinator who knew where every body was buried because she had been there when most of them were put in the ground. 6 people. 1 building. 1 woman who had been in worse situations before breakfast. Rochelle noticed everything on the first day. She noticed that her office had been cleared out but not cleaned. There was still a film of dust on the windowsill, and a calendar from 2 years ago still thumbtacked to the wall. She noticed that the supply closet on her floor required a key code she had not been given. She noticed that when she arrived at the 8 a.m. leadership meeting, the chair at the head of the table had been placed slightly apart from the others, as if someone had moved it there to separate her without making it obvious. She sat down in a different chair. She didn't say anything about it. She pulled out her portfolio, uncapped her pen, and she started writing. She had started keeping a log on day 1 of her first deployment when a senior officer told her that in this environment, your word alone wasn't worth anything. Paper was. She had kept that habit for 21 years. A plain black notebook, small enough to fit in a blazer pocket, dates, times, names, exact words. Not emotional accounts, just facts. She filled them the way a surveyor maps land, precisely, without opinion, because the value is in the accuracy. The notebook she started at Beaumont Memorial was her 43rd. By the end of the first week, the pattern was clear. The key code for the supply closet never came. When Rochelle submitted the request through proper channels, Gwen from HR sent a response that referenced a policy requiring new department heads to complete a facilities orientation before receiving access to restricted areas. The facilities orientation was scheduled, and then rescheduled, and then rescheduled again, each time with a note from Lawrence Peck's office citing prior commitments. Victor O'Mara began holding informal staff meetings during the 30 minutes before Rochelle's scheduled floor rounds. Not official meetings, just conversations. Coffee in hand, leaned against the nurse's station, talking just loud enough that by the time Rochelle arrived, whatever he'd said was already in the air. She noticed that her nurses would look at her differently after those conversations. Not hostile, just uncertain. Like they were waiting to see which version of her was real. Diane Volkov walked through Rochelle's unit twice a day, every day, always stopping to check in with staff members in a way that was warm and familiar, and made Rochelle's own presence feel new and untested by comparison. Diane had been at Beaumont for 11 years. She knew every person on that floor by their children's names. And Stuart Keene, at the biweekly directors' meeting, had a particular skill. Whenever Rochelle spoke, he would let the sentence end, wait a beat, and then turn to someone else and continue the conversation as if what she had said was either obvious or insufficient to warrant response. Not every time, just enough times that it became the weather in that room. Something everyone felt and no one named. Rochelle documented all of it. She did not confront. She did not complain. She emailed Dr. Penn twice with update memos, professional, detailed, framing her progress and her challenges in operational language. She kept copies. She also kept doing her job. On day 11, she restructured the medication administration schedule on her floor and reduced dispensing errors by 31% in the first week. The nurses noticed. She gave them the credit in the all-staff report. On day 18, she identified a recurring gap in overnight staffing that had been producing chronic overtime costs for 2 years. She presented a corrected model to finance. They approved it in 4 days, the fastest any of her proposals had moved. On day 22, she stayed until midnight to help the overnight team manage a surge in admissions, working alongside the floor nurses, not above them. Victor O'Mara, who had been watching all of this with the careful attention of a man recalibrating, said nothing, but he stopped holding his pre-round conversations. The other 5 did not recalibrate. The incident in the corridor happened on a Thursday afternoon in the 4th week. Rochelle was walking from the director's meeting to her office, portfolio under her arm, when Stuart Keene came up behind her with Lawrence Peck. They were deep in a conversation that did not require her to be there, which was, she understood exactly the point. The new CNO position was never really designed to oversee facilities coordination, Stuart said, and even without seeing his face, she could hear the casualness of it, the way a man sounds when he's saying something rehearsed in the register of something offhand. Diane's model was more complementary, more collaborative. Lawrence said something that sounded like agreement. Dr. Penn has been very supportive, Rochelle said, without turning around. A pause. They had not expected her to respond. I'm sure he has, Stuart said. And then he stepped forward so that he was walking alongside her rather than behind her, which changed the geometry of it in a way that was designed to feel like he was graciously including her, when in fact he was adjusting his position to talk over her head to Lawrence. It's just, a hospital this size, the CNO role really depends on relationships built over time. That's a longer runway than 6 months. He reached out and adjusted the collar of his own jacket, a gesture that had nothing to do with anything except that it drew Lawrence's eye, and for one moment, the two of them looked at each other the way people look at each other when they have already agreed on something. Rochelle stopped walking. "Stuart," she said. He stopped, turned. "I want to make sure I understand what you're saying." Her voice was the same as it always was. Level, unhurried, the voice of a woman who had given briefings under fire. "Are you suggesting that my performance in this role should be evaluated by the depth of relationships I haven't yet had the access to build, rather than the outcomes I've produced in the first month?" The corridor was not empty. 2 nurses were at the station 20 feet away. A physician was walking in from the far end. Stuart smiled. The kind of smile that is designed to make the other person feel as though they've overreacted. I'm just offering some friendly guidance. I appreciate that, Rochelle said. I'll make a note of it. She turned and walked to her office. She opened her notebook. She wrote the date, the time, the location, and the exact words she could remember. Then she wrote the exact words she had said. Then she closed the notebook and set it in her top drawer and went back to work. The retaliation escalated after that. Gwen from HR sent a formal memo citing concerns about communication style on the floor. Not a complaint from any named individual, just a general note, the kind of thing that looks like nothing from the outside, but is designed to create a paper trail from the inside. Lawrence delayed the approval of Rochelle's facilities orientation again. 6 weeks in, she still did not have the access code. Stewart removed her from the distribution list for the monthly capital allocation meeting, an administrative oversight that was corrected only after she emailed the board secretary directly to confirm her attendance, and Pam Duchesne began losing Rochelle's interdepartmental communications. Not all of them, just enough. A referral here, a scheduling request there. Rochelle kept sending copies directly to the relevant parties and keeping records of every sent message. Her notebook was now 63 pages long. She also did something that none of them anticipated, because none of them had thought to find out who she was before they decided who she was. She called a friend. Dr. Ren Alcott was 61 years old, a retired Army colonel and former medical command surgeon who now sat on the board of the Joint Commission on Accreditation of Healthcare Organizations, the body that granted and renewed hospital accreditation across the country. Rochelle had served under Ren in 2007. They had stayed in contact for 16 years. The call lasted 22 minutes. Rochelle did not make accusations. She described, factually, a pattern of administrative interference that was affecting patient care outcomes, and she asked Ren for guidance on how best to document a formal compliance concern. Ren told her. Rochelle thanked her and went back to her floor. The board meeting, at the end of the second month, was not supposed to be eventful. It was a quarterly review, standard agenda, standard presentations. Rochelle was scheduled to present the nursing division's performance metrics for the period, which she had prepared in a 40-page report that she had asked to distribute to board members in advance. The request had gone through Pam, and it had been delayed. The report had not been distributed. Rochelle arrived with 50 printed copies and placed one in front of every seat before anyone sat down. Stewart arrived and looked at the report on the table in front of his chair, and then looked at Rochelle and said nothing. When her segment came, Rochelle stood at the front of the room and presented her data. The 31% reduction in dispensing errors, the staffing model that had already saved the hospital an estimated $218,000 in overtime costs in 7 weeks, the patient satisfaction scores for her floor, which had risen 11 points in 6 weeks, the largest single-period increase in the hospital's recorded history for that unit. She presented without flourish. She let the numbers do the talking, the way she had learned to do in briefings where what you said was less important than whether you could prove it. Then she paused. "I'd also like to address something before I close," she said. Dr. Penn looked up. Rochelle opened her portfolio and placed on the table a second document, a 47-page file she had prepared over the previous 2 weeks. It contained a complete log, organized chronologically, of every incident she had documented, the withheld access codes and the policy cited to withhold them, the facilities orientations scheduled and canceled, communication from HR citing unnamed concerns, the removal from the capital allocation meeting distribution list, the pre-round conversations Victor had held during her first 3 weeks, the corridor exchange with Stewart, dated and timed and word for word. She did not use the word hostile. She did not use the word discrimination. She did not have to. The document described a pattern of coordinated administrative interference, and the pattern described itself. "I've also submitted a parallel version of this documentation to the Joint Commission," she said, as part of an ongoing compliance inquiry. The room was very quiet. Stewart Keene's face did not change, which told her more than any expression would have. Dr. Penn asked for a 20-minute recess. What happened in the weeks that followed happened the way things happen in institutions when the exposure is too documented to survive. Slowly, officially, and without anyone saying out loud what it was actually about, Gwen Aldridge resigned at the end of the month, citing personal reasons. Her successor, an outside hire named Dr. Portia Sims, came in with a mandate to review the department's policy application records for the previous 18 months. The review was still ongoing at the time Rochelle gave this account. Lawrence Peck was placed on administrative leave pending an investigation into contract processing irregularities, approvals that had been expedited for certain vendors and stalled for others in ways that did not align with stated criteria. The investigation was referred to the state health department. Stuart Keene was not removed. He was laterally transferred to an advisory role, which at Beaumont Memorial was what removal looked like when the board was not yet ready to say the word out loud. His office was reassigned, his calendar cleared. He still had a title. Diane Volkov's transition advisory contract was not renewed. Victor O'Mara requested a transfer to the hospital's second campus across town. The request was approved. Pam Duchesne was reassigned to a different department. She and Rochelle never directly discussed what had happened. As for the Joint Commission, the inquiry that Rochelle's documentation had prompted was still active. The hospital had submitted its response. A site visit was scheduled for the following quarter. Nobody at Beaumont Memorial talked about it in the hallways, but it was the thing everyone knew was coming, the way you know weather. On the morning that the transfer of Stuart's office was finalized, Rochelle arrived at work at her usual time. She stopped at the nurse's station on her floor. She had brought coffee, not for any occasion, just because she passed the good place on Meridian Street and it was not much out of her way. One of her nurses, a woman named Teresa, who had been with the floor for 9 years and had spent Rochelle's first 3 weeks watching her with the wary attention of someone who has been disappointed before, poured a cup and held it with both hands. "You knew from the beginning," Teresa said. Not quite a question. "I knew what I was walking into," Rochelle said. "I've walked into worse." Teresa looked at her for a moment. "My last CNO, when things got hard, she disappeared. Just stopped coming to the floor. Said she had meetings." "I have meetings," Rochelle said. "You also have coffee." Rochelle smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that has something behind it. She went to her office. She took out her notebook, the 43rd, and she opened it to the next blank page. She wrote the date. She wrote nothing else. Then she capped her pen, set the notebook down, and looked out the window at the parking lot below and the pale morning sky above the tree line. 21 years, 43 notebooks, 31%. She had not come to Beaumont Memorial to make enemies. She had not come to prove anything. She had come to do a job that needed doing, in a building that needed the kind of leadership it had apparently never quite been able to sustain. She had done the job. The rest had arranged itself around that fact, as things tended to do when you were patient enough to wait and careful enough to write everything down. She heard the morning shift change beginning out in the hall, voices, footsteps, the particular energy of one team handing the world over to another. She picked up her portfolio and went to meet her floor.